In Capua, before first light, a potter doesn't need an emperor to feel empire. He hears it in the steady of hooves on stone, power expressed as routine, designed into daily life. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, set a standard. Distance could be measured, travel time could be anticipated, and therefore orders could be managed. Along its length, mile markers stood like the state's quiet paperwork. Distance became numbers. Numbers became responsibility. On that same grid moved the cursus publicus, the most highly developed postal system of the ancient world, running through relay stages placed at practical intervals, where horses could be changed and official messages kept moving faster than rumor. In the forum, authority was compelled to speak in writing. The Law of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, was inscribed on 12 bronze tablets and publicly displayed, so citizens could know the boundaries of justice. If you want to follow how Rome turned roads and written law into durable control, subscribe so you don't miss the next part. From that first stretch of basalt, the narrative widens. A road is not merely stone. It is a contract with distance. Rome's road system ran from Britain to the Tigris, Euphrates, from the Danube to Spain and North Africa. About 50,000 miles of hard-surfaced highway, laid first for military necessity and then inherited by every ordinary purpose that followed. Along those great lines, the state installed an architecture of speed. The relay stages of the cursus publicus set at convenient intervals, so a rider could change horses, hand off dispatches, and keep the administrative pulse unbroken. When distance becomes a number and travel becomes a timetable, authority no longer needs to shout. It simply arrives on the expected day, at the expected gate. Control begins to feel less like coercion and more like routine. Inspection, repair, standards, and the quiet certainty that the road remembers where it is going. Yet speed is fragile, without endurance. Rome's builders answered with a material that behaves like policy. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, made by mixing lime mortar with sand, water, and pozzolana, then binding it with stones and broken brick. Poured into wooden forms and left to harden, it freed architecture from the tyranny of perfectly cut blocks. Pozzolana itself was a hydraulic cement perfected by Roman engineers, prized because it could set with strength where plain lime would fail. Mixed with lime, it gave mortar and concrete the toughness needed for bridges and heavy masonry. Concrete made the arch and the vault not a flourish but a discipline. Weight redirected, thrust contained, space expanded by geometry. In the half-light of a basilica or bath hall, coffered ceilings do not merely decorate, they prove that a repeatable building logic has taken root. And once a logic is repeatable, it becomes portable. Bridges, reservoirs, vaults, and domes rising to the same grammar across provinces. From stone and mortar, the story turns to water, softer than rock, yet decisive for city life. Aqueducts carried fresh supply to distribution points, sometimes from far beyond the urban horizon, and historically, such systems helped keep drinking water freer of human waste and other contamination, improving public health where sewerage was primitive. Much of the system ran as underground conduits of stone or terracotta pipe, unseen yet relentless, holding a careful gradient for miles. But bringing water in was only half the discipline. Water also had to leave. The Cloaca Maxima began as an open channel in the 6th century BCE, then was enclosed from the 3rd century BCE with a stone barrel vault. It drained storm water from the Forum toward the Tiber, and later took connections from major baths and latrines. Notice the cadence. Conduit, fountain, bath, drain. Cleanliness engineered into expectation. Infrastructure steadies the body, law steadies the mind. In 451 to 450 BCE, Rome's earliest written legislation, the Law of the 12 Tables, was inscribed on 12 bronze tablets and publicly displayed in the Forum. After plebeians pressed for rules no magistrate could twist in private. That act did not erase inequality, but it made the rules visible, and visibility changes a society's temperature. When law is posted, it can be learned, cited, and contested. Officials must justify decisions within a shared frame, not hidden custom. Over time, Roman legal procedure became a long-evolving court system whose later forms helped shape procedure in civil law traditions. In many periods, the magistrate framed the case and the remedy, while the judge evaluated the facts, an early division of labor that made justice administrable at scale. The point for empire is simple. Power lasts longer when it can be translated into predictable process, petitions, hearings, judgments, and records that outlive any single office holder. Predictability also marches. The legion was not merely manpower. It was an organization trained to operate as coordinated parts. In tactical terms, it functioned as small, well-integrated units working together. Teamwork turned into doctrine, arranged to support one another rather than collide in a single mass. And when conditions demanded protection over speed, soldiers could form the testudo, overlapping shields to cover front and top, a moving geometry of discipline, especially useful when advancing under missiles during sieges. The spectacle matters less than the habit behind it. Formations only work when hundreds of individuals accept the same timing, the same spacing, the same restraint. Drill converts panic into procedure. Procedure converts command into outcome. This is why Rome's military power could be carried from one province to the next without being reinvented each time. The legion was a portable institution, its order rehearsed until it became reflex, even in silence. An institution that asks endurance must also manage human limits. Roman medicine, shaped by Greek learning yet adapted to Roman needs, included medical officers in the army, public physicians for the poor, and even hospitals. One excavated near Dusseldorf has been described as strikingly modern in design. On the table of the surgeon, bronze instruments speak with calm precision. Probes, forceps, scalpels, tools whose forms can feel unsettlingly familiar. The surviving kits suggest long continuity. Surgical instruments changed relatively little from the age of Hippocrates through Galen, and some designs remained recognizably similar until modern times. Their presence signals something crucial. Care organized as a system, not left to luck, with tools chosen, carried, cleaned, and used again. This is not a story for gore. It is a story for logistics. A soldier who expects treatment is more likely to trust the institution that demands discipline, so medicine becomes another supply line. Preservation depends on time, measured, agreed upon, and shared. In the Roman Republic, the Pontifex Maximus and the College of Pontiffs held authority to alter the calendar, and they sometimes did so to shorten or extend a magistrate's term. That flexibility was power, but it was also instability. In 46 BCE, Julius Caesar initiated a thorough reform that produced the Julian calendar, advised by the astronomer Sosigenes. The reform abandoned the lunar framework and arranged months on a seasonal basis in favor of a solar year of 365¼ days. To realign civic time with the sun, Caesar added days to that year until it totaled 445, an administrative reset so extreme it exposes the stakes of synchronization. A calendar is not astronomy in the abstract. It is payroll, court dates, tax deadlines, festivals, and the rhythm of public duty. When millions share the same today, the state gains an invisible roadway for obligation. Once time is synchronized, comfort can be systematized. The hypocaust, an open space beneath a floor heated by gases from a furnace, was developed by the Romans to warm rooms above. Used in bath complexes, it also appeared almost universally in private houses in the northern provinces. Heat moved underfoot and through walls, turning architecture into climate. And the thermi were more than plumbing. They were complexes designed for public bathing, relaxation, and social activity, developed to a high degree of sophistication. In steam and marble light, civic identity was rehearsed without speeches. Cleanliness, conversation, and routine gathered under one roof day after day. This is a quiet form of control. When daily life offers stable places that function well, the state's presence is felt as normal rather than intrusive. Engineering here is not only about warmth. It is about belonging, an empire made livable. Comfort, repeated, becomes loyalty without being named. To keep that livability supplied, Rome reached underground and outward. At Las Medulas in northwestern Spain, the mining process Pliny called ruina montium used immense bodies of water, collected in reservoirs, carried by long gravity canals, then released to break apart mountainsides. The metal that emerged was not mere ornament. It underwrote systems. Under Augustus, imperial mint policy based coinage on the gold aureus, set at 1/42 of a pound of gold, and the silver denarius, creating standards that could travel as easily as a message. Meanwhile, industry filled kitchens and marketplaces with quiet uniformity. Glass blowing, invented by Syrian craftsmen in the 1st century BCE, spread blown vessels across the empire, and terra sigillata, bright red, polished pottery, circulated widely from the 1st century BCE into the 3rd century CE. In the end, control rests in the ordinary. Coin, cup, plate, daily objects stamped with competence year after year. From coin and cup, Rome moved to something even quieter, the yardstick. Surveyors set up the groma, a cross with hanging plumb lines, so right angles could be planted into open ground as confidently as an arch is planted into stone. With that tool, land could be inventoried, divided, and remembered. Centuriation laid a grid across landscapes, often squares about 710 meters per side, turning countryside into legible units for settlement, taxation, and obligation. Even the basic foot of construction, the PS, clustered around a narrow range. Standards mattered because stones, contracts, and taxes all had to agree. Control did not begin at the palace door. It began where a boundary stone met a straight line. A province could be conquered once. It had to be measured repeatedly. And measurement produced files. Who owes what? Who holds what? Where the road must run? Where the ditch must drain? Empire, at its most durable, is geometry with paperwork attached. Once land could be read, it could be governed without the governor having to be everywhere. A province was not simply a place on a map. It was a bundle of powers assigned to a magistrate, then extended beyond a single year. In the older system, the Senate decided which provinces went to consuls or praetors, and lots assigned the postings. Later, imperial arrangements layered new channels of control on top of old forms. In many provinces, direct taxes were paid not to the governor, but to the emperor's procurator, an equestrian official whose financial authority could run largely independent of local politics. Indirect revenues, harbor dues, customs, contracted services were supervised more rigorously over time, as the state tightened its grip on collection. The effect is subtle but profound. Rome learned to separate command from accounting, judgment from revenue. The sword might open a province. The ledger kept it year after year. In practice, accounting demanded memory. So Rome built archives not as ornament, but as infrastructure, rooms where the state could outlast the men who ran it. The very word tabularium speaks of tablets and records, copies of treaties, senatorial decrees, lists of magistrates, and the routine paperwork that turns authority into a continuous line. On the Capitoline slope, the tabularium rose above the forum, a repository for public records and offices, its long corridor looking out through repeated arches. The message was architectural: law below, records above, the city's noise beneath, the state's memory overhead. Clerks measure time in bundles and seals, not in speeches. And memory changed behavior. A petition can be delayed, a witness can be intimidated, but a document, copied, filed, retrieved, makes power answerable to its own past. This is how control becomes patient. It learns to wait because it can store. Across the empire, local tabularia echo the same idea. Administration is a discipline of remembering. Yet, records do not calm a hungry city. Rome's control also rested on a promise as old as the crowd: bread will arrive. The Annona, Rome's grain supply system, was not a single warehouse, but choreography: ships, inspectors, barges up the Tiber, and vast area where grain could wait in the dark until it was needed. By the end of Augustus' reign, the system was headed by Prefectus Annoni, supported by subordinates in Rome and in the port cities where supply was received and stored. In Ostia and Portus, inscriptions track officials of the Annona moving among granaries, scales, and paperwork, an empire reduced to pallets and measures. This was not generosity, it was governance. Keep the grain moving, and the city stays governable. Let the flow break, and politics turns volatile. Control in Rome often smelled like wheat and river water. Distributions, fermentations, link the state to households in the most direct way, the ration in the hand. A system that can feed a metropolis can also demand obedience. Feeding the capital was only one side of the bargain. The other was access to judgment, an idea that traveled by paper. Across the provinces, people learn a new ritual: write your grievance, follow the chain of authority, and wait for a reply that carried the weight of Rome. Imperial practice developed protocols: petitions submitted in writing, investigation, decisions, orders, certification, and finally archiving, whether as originals or as registers that summarize the exchange. When emperors visited, provincials seized the moment to place their pleas at the top of the hierarchy, turning a personal encounter into a document with afterlife. What matters is not the romance of the audience, but the administrative trail. A rescript could be copied, cited, and carried back to a town council like a small piece of the capital itself. Control here is responsiveness made systematic. In that system, even resentment is forced into procedure, into dates, names, and clauses that can be checked. Procedure works best when people know where they stand. Over the centuries, Rome widened the circle of belonging, step by step, city by city, until in 212 CE, the Constitutio Antoniniana granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. The decree did something paradoxical. It created a unitary citizenship across 3 continents while explicitly preserving existing statuses and local legal traditions. In other words, Rome expanded the name citizen without demanding that every community forget itself overnight. That is a particular kind of control. It does not crush differences. It organizes them inside a larger framework of rights, duties, and appeal. Citizenship became both reward and mechanism, a promise of protection, a clearer path to courts, and a stronger claim on taxes and service. When identity is standardized, administration becomes lighter. The state spends less effort asking, "Who are you?" and more enforcing what follows, even at the empire's edges. But Rome did not rule every street corner from Rome. It ruled by teaching towns to govern themselves in Roman forms. Many non-citizen urban centers, civitates, kept autonomy in local affairs under a governor's oversight, paid taxes, and administered the surrounding countryside. Over time, large numbers gained the status of municipia, adopting magistracies and local senates, duoviri, aediles, a curia or ordo, so that Rome could be present as a template rather than a garrison. This is where empire becomes most durable, when local elites invest in the system because the system runs their city. A forum is built, baths are maintained, roads are repaired, often by local obligation as much as imperial command. Control is distributed, and therefore resilient. The center sets standards, the periphery performs them. And when the performance is civic pride, coercion can step back. In early Italy, a municipium could mean citizenship without the vote, a reminder that inclusion was graded, calibrated, and negotiable. That calibration became an imperial tool. Templates endure only if they are maintained. Rome treated maintenance as a public office, not a private afterthought. Augustus appointed magistrates, the curators virum, to supervise roads, award contracts, and oversee construction and repair. The empire's great routes were kept alive by inspection as much as by conquest. Water, too, required guardians. In 97 CE, Sextus Julius Frontinus was appointed curator aquarum, and he wrote a treatise on Rome's water supply that is as revealing for its administration as for its engineering. He speaks the language of management, allocation, illegal tapping, measurement, accountability. In these curatorships, power looks almost modern, not because the technology is modern, but because the mindset is. Control is the willingness to count what flows, to audit what leaks, and to punish what is stolen. A road that is repaired and an aqueduct that is monitored do more than serve comfort. They make authority credible. And credibility is half of obedience. Credibility must also fit in the palm. Under Augustus, imperial mint policy anchored coinage to a clear standard. The gold aureus set at 1/42 of a pound of gold, equivalent to 25 denarii. The denarius defined in silver weight, with subsidiary brass and copper coinage beneath it. A standard like that is more than economics. It is a promise that payment, tax, and soldier's wage can be compared across distance without endless argument. Coins then become roaming documents, values struck into metal, portraits and titles carried into markets that will never see the capital's monuments. This is why debasement, when it comes, is not merely a financial problem. It is a political tremor. Trust thins, and every transaction asks silently, will Rome still stand behind this? In Rome's best years, the answer is engineered. By purity, by weight, by law, by the state's insistence that money remain legible, to the last detail. Return, for a moment, to the potter in Capua. His hands are dusty, his kiln is modest, and yet his life is threaded through an imperial design he may never name. The road beneath his cart is surveyed, funded, and supervised. The water in his city is captured, channeled, and drained. The law that settles his disputes is posted, copied, and remembered. The coin he takes at market is weighed against the standard, and the grain that keeps the crowd calm is managed as carefully as any legion. None of this is accidental. Rome maintained control for centuries by building systems that could be repeated, measurements that match, offices that audit, procedures that file, and infrastructures that make daily life predictable. The genius is not any single monument. It is the way monuments, paperwork, and habit reinforce one another until authority feels like the natural shape of the world. In the next movement of this story, we look at how that design met crisis and adapted. By the 3rd century, the old Roman confidence had begun to fracture. Rapid successions, strained frontiers, and a currency that no longer carried the same quiet authority. Rome's answer under Diocletian was not a single victory, but a redesign of command, built for cities and camps alike. The Tetrarchy, formally established in AD 293, divided imperial leadership between 2 senior emperors and 2 juniors, a system meant to make succession planned, not improvised. The idea was bluntly practical. If crises erupted in more than one region, then government had to exist in more than one place. Power became distributed, mobile, and, at least on paper, redundant. Even its public image changed. Rulers were shown as a unified set, less like individual heroes and more like an institution with 4 faces. In that shift, Rome signaled a new truth about control. Endurance depends on structure, not charisma, and structure must be repeatable. A redesigned command needed a redesigned map. Diocletian broke large provinces into smaller ones, then regrouped them into roughly a dozen dioceses, overseen by vicars who answered upward through the system. Above them, Praetorian prefects lost much of their direct military role but gained something more enduring: legislative, judicial, and especially financial power. The administration of the annona, now the backbone of the fiscal system, effectively gave these prefects management over the wider economy. Taxes, too, were recalibrated. Sources describe new levies such as the jugum and the capitatio. The result was a state that could count more precisely, collect more predictably, and allocate more reliably, with fewer blind spots. Roads moved orders, but this hierarchy moved responsibility. Rome was learning to govern by subdivision, smaller jurisdictions, clearer chains, and paperwork that could travel farther than any governor's voice. Yet numbers do not guarantee stability when prices run ahead of trust. In AD 301, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, denouncing profiteering and attempting to cap prices and wages across a wide range of goods and services. It survives only in fragments, mostly from the Eastern Empire, evidence of how policy, even when ambitious, depended on local display and enforcement. Its surviving lists read like a catalog of necessity: food, transport, labor, craft. Ancient criticism and modern scholarship alike emphasize its limits. Enforcement appears uneven, and the edict did not permanently stop inflation. But its significance lies elsewhere. It shows a government thinking in system terms, trying to synchronize markets the way it synchronized roads and calendars. When the state believes that disorder is measurable, it also believes disorder is correctable. Sometimes that confidence overreaches. Still, the edict marks a revealing moment. Empire attempting to govern not just territory, but the daily arithmetic of life. The longer solution was not a ceiling, but a standard. In the early 4th century, Constantine introduced the solidus, a high-purity gold coin that replaced the aureus and held a remarkably consistent weight for centuries. In a world where silver denominations had been battered by debasement and emergency minting, this was a deliberate anchor, money designed to be believed again. A stable coin does more than ease trade. It steadies tax assessments, soldier pay, and contracts that must hold across distance and time. It also narrows the space for improvisation inside government. When a unit of value is trusted, administration can plan. Here the empire's logic returns to engineering. Like a well-laid road or a calibrated aqueduct gradient, the solidus was a measured object that resisted drift. Rome had always understood that control depends on legibility. With Constantine's gold, value became legible again, small, bright, and difficult to argue with. Money steadied the ledger, The army needed its own redesign. Late imperial strategy increasingly distinguished between forces stationed on the edges and forces kept ready to move. Frontier troops, the Limitanea, garrisoned forts along the limes, living close to the boundary they guarded. Field armies, the comitatenses, formed a mobile corps, meant to respond where pressure appeared, rather than wait behind a wall. The distinction was not merely tactical, it was administrative. Different pay, different status, different expectations, an institutional division of labor that matched the empire's geography. A frontier fort could delay a raid and buy time. A field army could restore order at scale. Control then became layered, deterrence at the border, reaction in the interior, and coordination through the same courier routes that once carried census and tax. In the earlier empire, one might imagine a single line of defense. In the later empire, defense became depth, systems within systems, designed to bend without breaking. Depth begins with a frontier that is readable. The Roman limes was not always a single wall. It evolved from paths and military roads into networks of watchtowers, forts, and where terrain demanded, continuous barriers. At its greatest extent in the 2nd century, Rome's frontiers stretched for thousands of kilometers, stitched together by local solutions under an imperial idea. Hadrian's Wall, begun in AD 122, makes the concept visible in stone. Its purpose was to control movement across the frontier and meet low-intensity threats, not to fight from the top of the wall itself. In other words, it was a filter as much as a shield, channeling traffic, concentrating observation, and turning open landscape into monitored space. This is control by architecture. A border becomes governable when it can be patrolled, supplied, and understood as a chain of nodes. The wall is famous. The routine behind it is the true instrument. Nodes mean little without messages moving between them. In the later empire, the state relied on agents in rebus, official couriers and agents, who carried dispatches and performed duties for the central government. They operated under the magister officiorum, the master of offices, and appear in sources as a replacement for earlier disliked personnel. What matters is the principle: control travels at the speed of information. A governor can manage a province only if instructions arrive, reports return, and misconduct can be noticed beyond the local circle. Couriers, therefore, become more than messengers. They are an extension of the capital's eyes and hands, appearing at checkpoints, offices, and courts with the authority of distance. Combined with the relay logic of the postal system, such agents made the empire feel less like a scattering of cities and more like a single bureaucracy with many doors. Roads carried stone and grain. They also carried scrutiny, and scrutiny is a form of power that rarely needs to raise its voice. Bureaucracy, once mature, begins to describe itself. The Notitia Dignitatum, compiled for the late Roman world and usually considered most accurate for the West in the 420s and the East in the 390s, lists thousands of civil and military posts from the imperial court to the provinces. It is an extraordinary document not because it tells a dramatic story, but because it reveals a governing imagination, authority as a catalog. Offices have titles, staffs, jurisdictions, and places. Army units have names and assignments. The empire, in this view, is not merely territory. It is an organizational chart, and charts change behavior. When roles are enumerated, a vacancy can be filled, a chain of command can be traced, a responsibility can be claimed or denied. In an age of distance, the Notitia suggests a state trying to remain knowable to itself. Control is easier when a machine can be named, part by part, even as the world shifts under it. Naming roles is one step, naming law is another. In the 5th century, the Codex Theodosianus gathered imperial legislation from AD 311 to 437, commissioned in 429 and published in 438, then brought into force across both halves of the empire in 439. A compilation like this is not mere scholarship. It is an administrative repair. Scattered rulings, rescripts, and constitutions are turned into a usable tool for judges and officials who must decide cases consistently. In a vast state, inconsistency is a hidden tax, paid in delays, corruption, and disputes that never end. Codification reduces that tax by making rules searchable, teachable, and harder to counterfeit with local tradition. It also turns the emperor's voice into a durable archive, less dependent on memory and more on reference. Roads, coinage, armies, frontiers, each had standards. With the Theodosian Code, legal authority sought the same stability, law that could be carried, quoted, and applied with fewer improvisations. Step back now, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Rome maintained control for centuries not by a single secret, but by stacking systems until they reinforced one another, a subdivided administration that could count, a currency that could be trusted, an army organized in depth, frontiers built as networks, couriers who made distance governable, archives that preserved memory, and law compiled into usable form. Each layer reduced friction. Each layer made the next layer believable. That is the empire's true monument, not only walls and vaults, but the disciplined habit of standardization, repeated so often it begins to feel like nature. Even when crises forced Rome to adapt, the response was rarely pure improvisation. It was redesign. And redesign is a technical act. Measure what fails, strengthen what holds, and make the new version repeatable. In the next part, we will watch how these systems face pressures they could not fully control, and what those pressures reveal about the limits of organization itself. Subscribe to continue the series. The machine could be redesigned, but it could not control the movement of peoples. In the late 4th century, the Huns burst into southeastern Europe, crushing older balances beyond the Danube and driving communities toward Roman borders. The Visigoths, settled north of the river, were pressed south in 376 and permitted to enter imperial territory, an act that began as managed reception and ended as crisis. Exploitation by officials turned permission into resentment. Resentment hardened into revolt. What matters is the pattern. When a system built on schedules meets a flood of displaced families, the old instruments, forms, quotas, rations, strain first, then fail. Rome had mastered the engineering of stone and water. Now it faced the engineering of human motion, how to admit, feed, disperse, and recruit without surrendering authority. In that narrow gap between policy and practice, control slipped, not in a single collapse, but in a series of administrative frictions that could not be paved over. The empire's next move was compromise made official. Treaties, favora, had long bound allies to Rome, but now the logic shifted. Entire groups could be settled within imperial land in exchange for service. The vocabulary sounds orderly, federati, allies by contract, but the reality was new. The settlement might preserve internal leaders and customs while promising military support to the state. Under Theodosius I, the agreement of 382 with the Goths aimed to recover strength and repopulate wasted fields. Even in antiquity and modern scholarship, it has been argued as both necessity and risk. The bargain bought time, but it also planted armed autonomy inside the frontier. From this point on, Rome governed not only provinces, but partners, some loyal, some transactional, all capable of negotiating with force when the terms felt broken. Control became less absolute and more managerial, balancing obligations, distributing land, and keeping federate power tied, loosely, sometimes dangerously, to the empire's payroll and prestige. Then came the day when the empire's confidence met its limit in open field. On August 9, 378, near Adrianople, Emperor Valens led an eastern Roman army against the Visigoths under Fritigern. The result was not merely defeat. It was a demonstration that Rome's most disciplined infantry could be broken by opponents who combined mobility, numbers, and timing. Valens died, and the shock traveled faster than any courier. The frontier was no longer a line, but a zone of pressure. Later writers would argue over causes, haste, intelligence failures, exhausted troops, but the larger meaning is clearer. Adrianople marked the beginning of serious Germanic inroads into Roman territory, and it forced strategy to adapt toward negotiation, recruitment of outsiders, and layered defense. The empire still had roads, laws, and archives. Yet here we see the hard truth of systems. They are strongest when they can predict inputs. When the input becomes mass migration under arms, prediction becomes perilously thin. Pressure became precedent, and precedent became memory. In August 410, the Visigoths entered Rome under Alaric and spent 3 days plundering treasuries and palaces, an episode remembered less for physical ruin than for psychological rupture. Ancient and later observers noted that destruction was limited and that ordinary citizens were largely spared, yet symbolism does not require flames. The eternal city had been opened at night, and the world learned that Rome's aura could be breached. For administration, the message was devastatingly practical. If the capital itself could be taken, then no city could rely solely on reputation for safety. Authority moved further toward other centers. Loyalties became conditional. The empire's story was no longer one of inevitable order, but of negotiated survival. What began decades earlier as a problem of settlement and treaties now showed its final shape. Federate leaders could become kingmakers, and Rome's control, once embedded in roads and statutes, now depended on fragile bargains made under stress. By 476, the Western court was a shadow housed in strong walls and thin revenues. When the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, later tradition treated the date as an ending, the Western Roman Empire complete in its decline. Yet endings in Rome are rarely clean. Many institutions persisted, senators, laws, tax habits, while the Eastern Empire, richer and more stable, continued for centuries. Still, 476 matters because it reveals what Rome had been doing all along. Control was never only a legion or a single ruler. It was a layered discipline, standards in stone, schedules on roads, water measured by gradients, law fixed in public text, and authority stored in records. Those systems could absorb shocks for a long time. In the West, eventually the shocks outpaced maintenance. What remains is the lesson written into the ruins. Civilization is built by organization, and it survives only as long as organization is renewed. Subscribe if you want the next chapter of this Roman legacy.